Today, we're discussing the Telepathy Tapes, a podcast that explores the claim that nonverbal autistic children may have telepathic abilities. Created by filmmaker Kai Dickens, it presents personal testimonies and theories, but it faces strong skepticism from the scientific community. Is there hidden truth behind these claims, or is it just another fringe belief? Let's break it down. All right, guys, so this week we are talking about the hit podcast, The Telepathy Tapes. So, The Telepathy Tapes is a podcast created by Kai Dickens. She's a filmmaker. You're more than welcome to go check her out on IMDb. She's, been making documentary films for a number of years now. And the story goes that she was kind of down and out in life, and at one point was listening to another podcast that had Diane Henneke Powell, a neuroscientist, I want to say.
I think that's correct.
Okay. A neuroscientist on it who was claiming that autistic children, nonverbal autistic children, had telepathic abilities. Now, this claim really interested Dickens, and she continued to think about it and eventually teamed up with Powell and started a podcast. And in the future, they are going to release a documentary together. Now, during this episode, we're going to look at these claims and what we think about them and kind of go through some of the background of this. It's a pretty big claim. And the podcast, The Telepathy Tapes, tries to approach it with some scientific rigor. But we have some thoughts of our own about that, and let's get into it.
Yeah, I'm excited to discuss this one. I will first say that anybody who is listening should go listen to the podcast. It is an entertaining listen. Despite whatever preconceptions you may have, I would highly recommend you go into it with an open mind, and just take what is presented at face value and make your evaluations afterwards. It's a good listen. It's very entertaining.
Yeah, it's very, very well done.
Mhm.
The production quality of the podcast is great. It's very captivating to listen to.
Right. Um, so in the telepathy tapes, as Alex mentioned, Kai Dickens, the narrator and kind of journalist behind this whole thing, um, examines the claim that has actually been around for quite some time that nonverbal autistic people seem to exhibit the ability to read thoughts and minds, and have purportedly exhibited this in multiple studies and instances. Um, there have in the podcast, there are concrete examples where Kai goes out to people's houses, of parents who have nonverbal autistic children who claim that their children have exhibited this gift, power, whatever you call it. Um, they also purport that people who have this ability, um, can access a telepathic chat room almost, where they can converse with other people who are telepathic over long distances, in some cases, like, worldwide, um, and can converse in real time telepathically. Um, they also claim that people have said, some of these telepathic individuals have claimed that they talk with God or a higher power, have talked to people who have been deceased. They claim that this is evidence for something more metaphysical maybe going on, and that this is can be evidence for life after death. Um, They even mentioned that there are specific communities within this telepathic hill, um, realm. Um, in the podcast, I think they specifically mentioned that, uh, in Israel, there's Hasidic Jewish nonverbal autistic people who claim that they can go to a hill with only other Hasidic Jewish people, which is just an interesting little tidbit. and that this phenomenon, while there is no direct claim in the podcast of its mechanism of action, they do claim that it can occur even in the absence of any electromagnetic radiation, which is probably the most Occam's razor logical, more concrete evidence-based explanation of how this could happen. But they claim that this happens even in deep underwater, um, or in a Faraday cage, which prevents any electromagnetic radiation from penetrating. So, it is a tall claim. It's a tall claim. It's very interesting.
Hmm.
Do you guys have anything more to add about anything I missed from the podcast?
No, I don't think specifically from the podcast. You know, on this podcast, on our podcast, we've covered telepathy before, a little bit when we talked about the Montauk Project, and a little bit when we talked about the Schumann resonance,
Mhm.
and I guess when we talked about remote viewing.
Yep.
So you know, we're pretty familiar with this topic in general at this point. Um, and one of the things that kind of jumps out at me, and we'll get into it more as this episode progresses, is there's not usually a very strong scientific basis for these claims. You know, this podcast, the Telepathy Tapes, tries to maybe kind of add that back in. But we're going to talk about what our thoughts are there. But you know, the idea of telepathy, you know, as something humans can do is not an uncommon thing, that an uncommon thought to have. You know, it's pretty pervasive in our society. You know, there's many movies about it, many books. It's something that people at least are willing to entertain as being possible, but has yet to be kind of proven on the scientific stage.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, it seems like some of the studies that they mention might not be as rigorous as one would hope. Um, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I think one of my main gripes is that the claim it seems to be that there might be some evidence that nonverbal autistic people can pick up on things or might have specific gifts. Like there is savantism, you know, that's been proven where people are born with the ability to, you know, do crazy things like calculate unimaginably large prime numbers, which is notoriously a mathematically difficult thing to do, even with technology, computation, the forefront of mathematics. Um, you know, you have people who exhibit the ability to uh, tell you, you can give them a random date and they'll tell you what day of the week that date was laid on, even though it might have been hundreds of years ago. So there does seem to be something that autistic people might be capable of, or even just regular people. Or, I mean, obviously, we don't know everything about the brain. So,
Mhm.
um, it's good to keep an open mind about this, but I think my main gripe is that they take some of these stories and the leap is to, "Oh, well, they must be telepathic." And it doesn't seem like the real rigor, um, has been gone through in order to push out other possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanna say if we're all I think we're all coming at this from a pretty skeptical lens. But I just want to put out there that and kind of piggybacking what you were saying that there are plenty of them who are savants, as you said. That for anyone who believes this, like I hope no one mischaracterizes what we're trying to get at here. We're not trying to punch down on people with special needs here or
Of
anything like
course.
that. Like another example that popped into my head of there's a channel on YouTube that I highly recommend everyone go check out. It's called Drawings by Trent, and Trent is uh, almost fully nonverbal. He can say phrases, but he suffers from pretty severe autism. but he is an incredible artist where viewers of the channel will write in prompts of different characters and just like wacky ideas for him to draw. And he'll just manifest it on the page in the most fascinating way. It's so cool to watch him do this because, someone will give an example like, draw an elephant jumping on a trampoline. And it's almost as though you can watch, you can almost see the way his mind works, even though I don't understand it, obviously. Like he'll read the prompt, he'll consider it for a second, and it's almost as though he sees the drawing fully on the page before he's even begun, because he'll begin the drawing in unexpected, or not unexpected, but in he'll begin the drawing in places where you would not necessarily expect one to begin a drawing. And at first it just looks like a bunch of lines, blah blah blah. But then after about like 45 seconds, boom, there's an elephant jumping on a trampoline. And it's just remarkable how talented he is. But please, everyone, go check out Drawings by Trent. They have merch. Support them. They're awesome. So just want to put out there that, yeah, like obviously plenty of people who suffer from autism can be incredibly gifted
Right.
in a myriad of ways.
Right.
And go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, and I just want to, just so everybody understands the complexity of the situation. These are nonverbal people. It's difficult to really try to understand how things work for them in general. A lot of like our medical and scientific community is based on understanding things through language. I mean, that's kind of the backbone of all knowledge is language. So to try to, you know, get out of one of these, nonverbal autistic people, what exactly is happening? Why is it happening? Is just, very difficult,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we'll get into it here very soon, but maybe we should just jump into it now. The way that they're claiming these people are able to communicate is through something called facilitated communications, also abbreviated FC. There's another kind of thing very similar, kind of under that facilitated communication umbrella, known as spelling and known as rapid prompting method, the rapid prompting method. So what this is, and the way that I've seen it done, and correct me if I'm wrong or add anything, guys, is typically some type of like letter board, a board with a bunch of with all the letters on it is presented in front of one of these nonverbal autistic people, and they can't speak, but supposedly they're able to point out the letters of the words that they want to speak. So this is how it got its name, spelling. And some people claim that this is kind of the key to unlock the door in the mind of these people, that this is the only way that they're able to communicate. Now, I think facilitated communication has its issues. If you read online, you'll see a lot of scientific articles talking about how it's not what I guess proponents of it make it out to be. They claim that it's kind of it just works, but I think that there's some reasons why it works that may not be on behalf of the child themselves. It's so just to get a little deeper into it, one of the things that facilitated communication relies on is typically having a parent place their hand on the arm of the child who is doing the spelling or partaking in the rapid prompting method. And this just kind of makes me wonder the legitimacy of this. If you actually have to, place your hand on their arm or on their hand while they're doing, this pointing, who's really doing the pointing at the end of the day? Is it the child? Is it the parent? Is it a mix of the two? I would have I would see a lot more credibility in this if it was just like the letterboard is just a stationary object and the child's pointing out letters. If somebody could prove that worked, then I'd be on board for this, because I don't see that seems pretty infallible. It seems like that's, as good as gold. But when you have, you need this intermediary person to potentially move the other person's hand, it really muddies the water of who's doing the communication.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's a bit tough because, oftentimes not only are these people nonverbal, but they also can have fine motor skill impairments, and that can make it difficult for them to, do this on their own, which is valid. Um but uh and they go into this in the podcast. There's an organization called the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ASHA, um who deal with a lot of things related to communication, particularly for people who might be differently abled. And about this rapid prompting method, their official position statement is, quote, "It is the position of the American Speech Language Hearing Association that use of the rapid prompting method is not recommended because of prompt dependency and the lack of scientific validity. Furthermore, information obtained through the use of RPM should not be assumed to be the communication of the person with a disability." Unquote. And they say this because, like Alex mentioned, it requires the intervention and action of another person. It's not truly independent communication. They claim it takes away from the independence of vulnerable people. They claim that the will, even if not intentionally, of the people who are doing the prompting, can influence how what the things that are said. And in terms of studies, there apparently have been studies, but there are some big red flags about those studies. Like, people uh have refused to allow other ways of testing this that don't involve someone who's an experienced RPM prompter. Um, so it's a little unclear whether or not this method is beneficial or even valid in terms of being able to verify that somebody who is nonverbal um, can communicate on that level. You know.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And
It,
just to
it,
go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, like, taking away the telepathy aspect of this. I mean, I'm sure it's a your mileage may vary type of situation. If we're not speaking about anything potentially metaphysical, I'm sure
Mhm.
that there probably are instances where this has some degree of effect.
Mhm.
Um, but
Sure,
yeah, I
but
just
the
wanted to
the
throw that.
problem is how would we ever know? That's the
Right.
Sure,
issue.
sure, sure.
I'm sure,
I'm completely in line with you on that. Yeah.
yeah, that's one of the big issues is how would you ever know that it actually worked? It's not like you this is a condition you get better from and years later you're like, yeah, well, there's times I spelled for you. You understood what I meant. That's not going to happen.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's not really any confirmation here. So I think that this is a typical theme we see with a lot of these telepathic, kind of psi claims, is there's not really a way to confirm them. And this would be something that would be pretty easy to demonstrate in a scientific setting, but a lot of these things seem to rely on something that makes it difficult to actually claim or
Mhm.
difficult to prove, I should say. We saw it like with Preston Nichols. He's like, if you just build this thing and you have somebody who's psychic, they can use it. It's like that's like a difficult thing, and like somebody's gonna have to put a lot of money into doing that in order to prove it. And it's just I find a lot of these kind of subjects have that kind of fault to them.
Right.
But just to get into more of the faults of the rapid prompting method, you have to worry about kind of two things here, which is cueing. Is the parent actually giving some kind of cue to the child? We'll get into it, but it seems like a hit podcast or a hit documentary, there may be some financial incentive to having your child be able to perform this, right? It's you would hope and you really hope that these families are just that they're doing this just to be able to communicate with their child because they want to and they need to and they doing it for love. But when there's a potential financial gain here, you do have to wonder, if it could be some type of parlor trick,
Hmm.
not to be too insensitive, but could the parent be cueing the child, a little push on the hand in the right direction, to get them to point to the thing that they want them to. So you have to
And they
wonder
might not
about
even
that.
be doing it consciously.
Well, that's what I
Right.
want to get into.
Yeah,
So that's the
yeah, yeah.
ideomotor effect. So this is the
Hmm.
same thing that a lot of people claim is why a Ouija board works. There's
Hmm.
your body does a lot of subconscious things and is dictated by, your brain in a lot of ways that you don't even realize. Just like you don't have to think to breathe, you don't have to remember to keep your heart beating. There's a lot of, subconscious processes that are going on. So, could you be thinking of something and, because you're so concentrated on that, maybe your body moves a little bit in that direction, to in the child, points to that letter because it swayed a little bit. The letterboard swayed a little bit to the right because you were, so much hoping that they would get that letter. So,
Mm.
I'm not just saying that this is, just like a trick, something that the family's trained on. It could be, you know, just, an issue with just having, a parent involved at all. And it could just be,
Right.
a completely subconscious, non-nefarious kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like we mentioned, it's been proven that people with autism can possess unique skills, and who's to say that maybe they are just some people are extra sensitive to very subtle um you know body language or movement or something, so it could be very hard to know whether or not the parent or facilitator is in fact giving some sort of small clue or cue that normal people might think is like absurd that anyone could pick up on, but maybe these individuals are able to do that. Like my thing is with it is that we can first of all, I think that these study like rapid prompting method and this whole method of communication should be further and more exhaustively studied as a first. And I also think that if it does seem like something is going on, instead of making this claim that they're telepathic, we should just go, huh, something's going on. Let's not jump to a conclusion. Let's keep it on the table, but let's continue to rigorously verify whether or not this is actually what's going on,
Yeah. Which is
which seems
exactly
like
how
an
the scientific method is supposed to work, right?
right, right.
Right. And
Yeah.
and by jumping to telepathy, you may be missing out on something that could fundamentally change how we interact with these people.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's
that's a
really
great point.
it's really a
Honestly, that's a great point.
disservice to just jump to telepathy and just write off any other possibility.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a great point.
Yeah, it just seems so strange that, like I recall reading that people who have been involved in rapid prompting method studies are have shot down people trying to utilize eye tracking instead of, putting the board there and letting them choose the letters, which I think is a little suspect, right? Why wouldn't you open that option up? If they are capable of pointing out letters on a board, surely they're capable of, looking at the letter they intend to choose, right? And we have good eye tracking technology.
Hmm.
So, that seems as like an easy way to jump to something that's a little bit more rigorous and believable from a study point of view,
Yeah, one thing that was a red flag to me right away was like right in the beginning of the podcast, they actually come out and admit that the methodologies that they're using don't stack up to strict scientific scrutiny. But then they just kind of like gloss over that point and move on and wow the listener with what's happening. And to me, that really that was a shining moment to me of like, okay, something isn't there's something beneath this that is suspect. If they could
Mhm.
just casually and slyly just openly admit that this wouldn't hold up to scientific scrutiny, but then just kind of like blow past it.
Mhm.
I find I don't know
And to kind of
right
go off,
away.
yeah, and to kind of
Go
go
ahead.
off of what Brandon was saying about the studies, I read another study where they tested this rapid prompting method with a child and his mother, and it worked. And then they switched out the mother for the dad, and the child's accuracy fell greatly. So I can already see what the telepathy tapes would claim is the child's tapped into the mom and not the dad, and they have a stronger bond, and but it seems a little bit like mental gymnastics to me to make that kind of leap. um
Hmm.
but yeah, and also what you were saying, Chops, they do say that at the beginning of the podcast, and then I think they kind of, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but um, they're very clear. They're like, we covered up the TVs for all the reflections, and they really try to make it, after saying that, they try to make it sound like they really covered all their bases. Like things that you and I might not think about. They're like, oh, but we did that, and it's like it's almost like they're kind of showing off. Like, oh,
Mhm.
look, we thought of everything, and it's like, yeah, you thought of a couple low hanging fruit, but like to really test this thing, there's we got to really manipulate the different variables and try, a lot of different things, and not maybe do it in someone's house where we even have to cover up the TVs in the first place.
Right, and also to be clear, if we haven't drilled the point home clearly enough, like as an example, I saw there was one moment where there was one example where they're in the home of someone with an autistic child who was nonverbal, and to demonstrate this alleged telepathy, the parent would stand behind the child with a stack of Uno cards, and they would pull out Uno cards at random, so the child is facing the opposite direction, so they can't see allegedly what the Uno card is, and then using one of those boards would hit the correct number, and allegedly they had a success rate of like 90%, like 90% of the time, 8 9 times in a row they would get the correct number, which for that to happen accidentally would statistically would be in like one in hundreds of millions chance of getting like 9 guesses in a row correct. So uh, just to visualize it for someone who maybe hasn't listened to it, it's this kind of thing that's happening. Um, but yeah, that's what they claim. They claim they cover all of the any reflective surface, yada yada yada. But you know, we're kind of just taking their word on it for one thing.
Mhm.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? And we're ultimately just taking their word for it since it's not being conducted in a scientific setting. I mean, it sounds pretty crazy, but and and fascinating and somewhat outlandish, and perhaps it is.
Mhm. I think what's interesting to me too is ASHA, um, the organization we mentioned before, who say that this is pseudoscience, rapid prompting method I'm referring to, um, go so far as to claim that it's actually harmful, this practice in their purview, because uh, it it can misrepresent the true intentions or hinder the actual ability of these people to really effectively communicate, which can be harmful to them. Um, so
Yeah.
it it seems like it's something, you know, like that really shouldn't be taken lightly. These people are some of the most vulnerable people in society, as they even mention in the podcast. And it seems unfair that if it hasn't been thoroughly investigated to a level of like scientific rigor that we would expect from this kind of thing, that it's unfair to these people to make this assertion that they're saying things. It might be misrepresentative of what they're actually feeling or thinking inside, which, is really hard for us to know because they can't communicate and we don't have a way to probe into their mind, you know?
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as we go on, but like, to me it comes off as downright exploitative and rather gross. But we can delve into, you know, everyone's feelings about that as we go on.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, I just want to touch on, the ethical considerations a little bit. I mean, I agree with what Brandon's saying. It is potentially harmful, I think, both to the child and to the larger public. If we continue to act like these methods work, even if we prove that they don't, I mean, that's like a lot of wasted time where we could be, figuring out something that actually does work, or trying to, actually move forward and figure
Mhm.
out how to communicate with these people. Um, but yeah, it's also, potentially dangerous, to the families. I mean, I think it's good to have hope in general, but you also have to have some realism in your life.
Mhm.
I think personally, that's what I believe. So it just doesn't it just doesn't feel fair to anybody to entertain these things if they truly don't work.
Right. I think maybe a good analogy, and feel free to combat me on this, but one that I just thought of is that imagine you go to China and you have no ability to speak Chinese, right? Um, and you have somebody who's translating for you, right? And you point to, like, let's say, I don't know, some food item, right? And you're saying like, don't give me that, right? And even if, like, say they misconstrue it as, oh, this must be their favorite thing, and then they start giving you only that, right? Like, this is the kind of risk that we could be talking about. This kind of somebody speaking for someone else and could misinterpret it or misrepresent it or not truly understand what's going on, and it could negatively affect that person, right?
Right. And
Hmm.
since we can't communicate with these people, with nonverbal autistic people, we don't really know if they're frustrated or not. This is a pretty
Mhm.
common human emotion, frustration. Um, Potentially they could, you know, be frustrated, and or just, it just could be, it could just be nothing to them too, which it could just be wasting time when you could be trying to get some type of better communication method down. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think your analogy is good. It's, we don't know what they're feeling or thinking, so it's really hard to know if this is, having a positive impact on them, because I can see the argument. If you could prove that it was having a positive impact, it may be worth doing. So like, people when they have dead relatives go to, like, a psychic to, like, talk to their dead mom or dad, right?
Mhm.
And like, personally, I don't like that. I do not really, I don't support it. I think it's dumb, personally. But if it's something that makes you feel better, you know, is it worth doing? Maybe it is. I personally don't think that way, but if you get some type of, good feeling from doing that, this, it may be a positive sum at the end of the day. It may have been worth doing for you if you get closure or whatever it is. But the thing is, with nonverbal autistic people, we can't even know if they do get some kind of closure or good feeling from doing this. It could be frustrating for them or stressful for them to do it. And you hear in some of these interviews that Kai Dickens does, some of these children, they don't necessarily just want to sit down and just do this. It's not like, oh, like, watch me, look, I can do this, I want to show everybody. She claims some of them are like that, but some of them, it's like they have to really wrangle these kids to get them to sit down. And some of these kids are very active, and it's hard to get them to actually sit down and do this task. So at the end of the day, is it the right thing to do? I don't think we can know,
Mhm.
but it doesn't seem like a great thing to do, especially if we don't know.
Right. Right. Yeah, if maybe one day, we'll will possess the technology where, we can somehow interpret what's going on chemically in their brain in a way that allows us to get some sort of insight into their real feelings or communication. But until that point, and until we establish, you know, truly effective, well, I think there are even more effective ways of nonverbal people communicating, that Asha, you know, advocates for. But um, we should really stick to what we know works and keep the individual's well-being and autonomy and at the forefront of our thoughts when it comes to this whole thing. And it doesn't really seem like that's necessarily the case with rapid prompting method, and especially under the claim of telepathy.
Mhm.
So let's talk about the public reaction. Um
Yeah.
I From what I see, this podcast is highly successful and a lot of people are, you know, have really dived into this subject fully, and are more than
Yeah.
willing to accept the claim.
You
I
know,
mean,
it briefly usurped Joe Rogan's place as the #1 podcast. That's how big of a splash this has made.
Mhm.
and I mean, it's been mentioned on Joe Rogan's podcast as well. And Kai Dickens has made her rounds around the circuit. I mean, she's been on, um, I think who was it? Sean, what's his name? Ryan,
Sean Ryan?
Sean
Sean
Ryan's
Ryan?
podcast, or okay, maybe she wasn't on Sean Ryan. Sorry, she was on Jesse Michael's podcast,
Mhm.
and then she
Rick
was on
Rubin.
Rick Rubin. So she's definitely been on some bigger podcasts, and at the end of the day, these hosts seem to really eat it up. Like, they don't really question the validity of this. They just, the whole thing is there's kind of this vibe to it that, like, the scientific community doesn't want you to know. They're trying to hide it. And we'll get into that because I want to talk a little bit about Diane Henneke Powell's suspension, her license suspension, and I think maybe I'll just go into it now. But at one point, Diane Henneke Powell had her license suspended from the medical board in Oregon, and I've heard her a little bit say, like, they were trying to keep us quiet, or they didn't want me looking into this, and they kind of make it sound like there's like Men in Black, they're like, this is a taboo subject. But you really read why her license was suspended, and I can read you the exact quote from the suspension. The reason it was suspended was there was an evidence of a pattern of practice that includes poor management of therapeutic boundaries, incomplete chart notes that reflect a lack of attention to responsible medical detail, a disorganized approach to treatment, a failure to respond to significant patient symptoms, and concerns over her management of patient medications. So she was doing like these over the phone appointments, and never, a lot of her patients, she wasn't seeing them face to face often, or I think some of them ever. And she was trying to provide them with medication and medical assistance, and the board found that it was not in line with standard medical practices. Nothing in there. And once again, it's one of those things where they can say, well, they're not going to put it in writing, that they didn't want me looking into ESP. But uh, this doesn't seem like the reason she was suspended. This happened, I think, what, like maybe a year before her book came out, or a year after her book came out. Do you remember, Chops?
I believe it was 13 months after her book, which is titled, for anyone curious, The ESP Enigma: The Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena. Now, if memory serves from the research I did, she was officially suspended from the she was officially suspended 13 months after the book came out. So well over a year.
Right. And this just concerns me because, like, this is great clickbait for, like, what the medical industry doesn't want you to know about, nonverbal autistic people. And it's just, I'm not, obviously she didn't try to get suspended to sell the book, but it's pretty opportunistic, to to have this happen, and you have this book, and you can just claim they don't want you to know. They're trying to silence me. It's like she is far from the only person to ever do this.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So I just get a little concerned that her suspension can kind of be misconstrued in that way, in a way that's beneficial to the sales of her book.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely something that should be considered. Because she is the big advocate for this and has been for a long time. And while it's not a black and white damnation, it is definitely something you should keep in mind when you listen to her. Um, it does not leave such a great taste in one's mouth. You know,
Certainly not a good look.
yeah. Um, and like her claims and the claims of Kai in this podcast, strike me as like a little unethical again because they could be giving a lot of false hope to families with you know these kinds of kids or family members, where this might not actually be happening or might be misrepresented, and it could give people this idea that you know something is happening that's not really, and that's
Yeah,
just
that
downright unethical you
yeah,
know
that's it. That's one of the things that really rubs me the wrong way about this, man. Like it just like one should really tread lightly when dealing with a delicate subject like this. And I'm sure they've made so much money off of this podcast. They have probably been raking in the cash. If it was even briefly the number one podcast in the world, they're making money off of this thing.
Mhm.
Oh,
They're
for sure. And I mean,
making
they're
some serious
charging
dough.
what, like $10 to get the behind the scenes video before the documentary comes out.
Mhm.
That's correct. That's correct. They're charging extra money to see more of their quote unquote video evidence, which I have not personally seen myself because I'm not going to financially aid them any further beyond listening to it. Um, and again, this because I haven't seen it, I can't comment on it directly. But I was through my research scrolling through many comments on message boards of people who have seen the behind the scenes footage, and a repeated mantra I saw from a lot of these comments was that the video evidence doesn't stack up to what was represented in the podcast itself. The methodologies they were using, um, like what they claimed they were doing versus what was actually happening in the videos, which makes me think. It almost makes me think like maybe they don't care if they get found out as frauds. I mean, you've already given them extra money on top of the money that they made from the podcast itself. Like they might not even care, which just leads further to the grossness of this whole thing if that's really what's going on.
Right.
And
And
go ahead.
yeah, and so just kind of a thought that I just had is, not only are they potentially making money on this, I'd go on a limb to say there's probably a whole industry, for everybody from like people who are manufacturing letterboards specifically for this to I'm sure that there's like rapid prompting method practitioners out there. And I have proposed it to you guys before to do like a Lyme disease podcast where there's all of these, kind of doctors who have this same kind of thought like, oh, we're being silenced, but this is the true cure, when it doesn't really have scientific or medical rigor to it. But they're making like a shit ton of money because like this is your last hope. And this very much feels like that. Like this is your hope to communicate with your child. And
Mhm.
I don't know it for a fact, but I can only imagine like a rapid prompting method teacher, practitioner, whatever they would call themselves, could just charge these exorbitant fees to teach to unlock your child. So I would imagine there's probably a whole industry kind of propping this idea up.
Right.
So there's probably potentially a lot of people who are, indirectly profiting off of the telepathy tapes and this being part of the public conversation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I hadn't even considered that aspect of it. Like, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. There's just a lot of vulnerable people in this whole world and situation, Like it's not just the nonverbal autistic people, it's the families of those people, who have had to deal with a very hard reality having a child who has these kinds of disabilities, you know. And
Right, it's hard to fault them because like they're looking for hope. Like,
right.
if somebody
yeah,
came to
yeah.
you and you know, I don't want to call it ignorance, but like, if you have a child like this and you want to, of course you want to communicate with them. They're your child, you know. So to have somebody come to you and be like, well, they don't want you to know this, but there is a way. That's really kind of scummy. If that's
Yeah,
really what's going on, like you're really taking advantage of these people. And like I said, there's probably a lot of money behind it,
right.
you
And
know?
they may believe that this is real. Like Kai Dickens might really truly believe this and not have any malintention.
Sure.
However, you know, indirectly through not being thoroughly scientifically rigorous and making this claim, whether or not you have good intentions, you know, it doesn't really matter because you're still doing something that is borderline unethical, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my biggest fault with it is that, like I mentioned before, it's the jumping to this extraordinary claim. Um because, there very well may be something going on. It's just like what we talked about in remote viewing. Maybe there is some mechanism we don't understand that's involved here. Maybe there is some sort of perception or something that certain nonverbal autistic people have. But to make the claim that it's this metaphysical thing that has no verifiable grounds in what we understand to be the real physical universe, um, it just doesn't sit right with
Yeah.
me.
So I just did a quick Google search just to like back myself up and see if I was on the right track here. And I googled rapid prompting, I can't even say it, prompting training. And first hit I get upcoming level 1 training for parents and professionals, 4-day Zoom class, $950.
Mhm.
Wow.
So I'm sure that this is far from the only site doing this.
Mhm. Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely money to be made off of this. And like I said, I can see the parallel between this and some of the Lyme literate Lyme disease doctors, which I think would be a great podcast to do. But I think we'd come to a similar conclusion here that potentially people are taking advantage of vulnerable people, as kind of the last ditch hope, last hope effort. And I think that kind of behavior is just, as Chops put it earlier, gross and disgusting,
Mhm.
but to extend the olive branch, as Brandon said, Kai Dickens may truly believe this, and I think a lot of the general public, after listening to the podcast, truly believes this, and I can't truly disprove it myself because,
Mhm.
but it needs to be put through the scientific rigor. If you are claiming this, it could fundamentally change the world and would change the world if proven to be true. So it's important, if you truly believe this, you better, do your damnedest to get this thing studied and prove it to us, because
Right.
it will change everything. But until you
Mhm.
do that, I just sitting here, I'm like thinking, this is not good. This is taking advantage of people until you prove it.
Yeah, I agree. In the podcast they even go so far as to say that um some of these people can converse with people who have already died, converse with higher powers, with a god, and to make that kind of claim, is just such a step beyond, you know. It's It just shows it to me. It speaks to the fact that they, are not really going through proper scientific rigor.
And like a lot
It's
of and those specific examples that you just gave, talk to a god, talk to a deceased person. These are like improvable things, right? The person's
right.
dead. God is God. It's like how I can't ask God if he really talked to him, and I can't ask him, my dead aunt if they conversed with her. So like I just see this a lot in these specific type of like telepathic, you know, uh conspiracy theories, whatever you want to call them, is like these unprovable, unobtainable evidence. And it's, I, and it just it leaves a lot to be desired for me.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an effective tactic for those who don't look at it with a critical eye to make those unfalsifiable claims. But it's important to remember that the burden of proof always lies with the one making the claim,
Yep.
not the other way around.
Yep. It's very true. Um. So, do you guys have any theories? Like, let's say that let's just suspend our disbelief regarding rapid prompting. And let's say that there is something going on. Do you have any theories about what that could be other than telepathy? Or maybe you think it's could be telepathy?
Um so I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but so in this case, I think it's probably a mix between cueing and the ideomotor um, mechanism or whatever it's called.
Mhm.
I think that the parents are, whether or not they realize it, giving subtle cues to the children um, in order, in order to get them to do these feats. I don't think that there's any telepathy involved. Um, I have never come across anything that makes me believe in telepathy. The closest thing to that would be the fact that the government has researched it so in depth. That's the only thing that makes me think that there may be some credibility to people making these claims. But there's been plenty of verbal, normal people who have claimed these things, and they've never been able to prove them. So
Hmm.
I think that I think that's what's going on. Just and I think that follows Occam's razor pretty well too. I mean, that seems most likely what's going on. Now, once again, I have to say it is, I can't prove, I'm not a scientist. I don't have access to these people. I can't prove that it's not, you know, um, telepathy, but
Mhm.
I really just think that it's much more human and much more just normal, just bias rather than telepathy.
Yeah, yeah. I would echo everything Alex said, and also add that maybe this is very, what's the word, sardonic, is that the word, grimly cynical? But I would not be surprised if there's some outright fraud happening here.
Mm.
Like not just parents knowingly or unknowingly, like, or not just parents unknowingly leading their child to say certain things, uh, but I honestly wouldn't be surprised if we got to be a fly on the wall in the room, if we saw that the whole thing, that maybe certain parts of this were a complete fabrication. Would not shock me.
Hmm.
What do you
Yeah.
think, Brandon?
Yeah, I would agree with you guys. You know, I am the thing my brain goes to is if there are easy ways to, bolster your argument if you're making this claim. And it's just to me the biggest red flag as to the legitimacy of this. Put the prompting board on a robot's arm or on a stand in front of the kid and let them do it. Have somebody who is completely unrelated come up with a completely random phrase and, use that instead of Uno cards or something, or use a random number generator, like a true random number generator. And if they're making the claim that they can read people's minds to the extent that they do, have somebody come up with a memory from when they were a kid that, they have told nobody involved in the situation, and then have somebody, somebody who's apparently able to do this spell it out. I believe that it's probably, like you guys said, some cueing, whether intentionally or unintentionally on behalf of the prompter or the parent. Um, but, I would be open to the idea that, maybe, like I mentioned before, maybe people who suffer from this uh, specific type or level of autism might be able to perceive very, very subtle cues in ways that we don't, which, I think would be interesting in its own right to study. And I think that that would be a way to go about it, is to say, maybe make that claim and then set up some experiments like that. See if they can pick up on um, some sort of subtle cueing that a normal person might not be able to, or something like that.
I mean,
Um,
actual
mhm,
scientists are always saying how important body language is. I mean, that seems to be something that actually is proven to be, interpretable and important.
mhm,
And if you kind of marry that with the idea, we've all heard it before, like, you're blind, somebody's blind, so then their hearing is like extra sharp. And I'm sure that there's studies that, you know, that these blind people may be more sensitive to noises. Like, these things are not wild thoughts to have, and I
mhm,
think are probably or very much fit within the scientific understanding of things, right?
right.
But yeah, so I think when you kind of put those two things together, I think you're hitting right on the money, at least for me, with that being part of it as well.
Mhm, right. And like, it's a really nice thing to, want to believe. I mean, if I, like you mentioned before, if you had a kid who you had never been able to converse with, and you heard about this, it would give you a lot of hope, and you would be way more inclined to go into it with a suspension of disbelief, or even a bias towards, wanting to prove it as correct. And that just makes me so skeptical of it, and brings me back to this whole ethical issue, where it seems like um really irresponsible, uh knowing that there are so many vulnerable people involved in this, to go this far, and to go this far publicly, you know
Right.
so
I mean, you just can't discount, as we've said a couple times, this podcast, wildly popular,
right.
definitely made some money. They're selling
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
videos. They're coming out with a documentary. I literally found an example of a $950 Zoom class for rapid prompting method. I mean, just follow the money on this one.
Right, right.
Yep. Follow
It's
the money. That's the mantra, man.
right. I mean, like if you've ever read like an actual scientific paper, you know, these scientists aren't necessarily there to make money on that specific thing. It's not like they get a bonus if their paper is more popular necessarily. I'm sure there's some instances where that happens, but like
Mhm.
they do it because it's their job to approach things with scientific rigor, and they write a paper based on their findings. That's how these things normally go. They don't normally go to a podcast or to a documentary as the first groundbreaking, reason. The right way to do it is to have the science built up, and then be like, there's all this good science now, and the public still doesn't know. Let's pull some real scientists in and make a documentary and show that this thing works. That's the proper way to do it. Just coming out with a podcast where you're clearly making money off of these people and their families is not the way to do it.
Right. It's like, "Oh, me and 10 other people I know have been eating these bleach-soaked lollipops, and it's been curing our stomach issues. So we're gonna make a podcast about this phenomenon and put it out into the public." And it's like, okay, is that the right thing to do? Or maybe you should, like, bring it, really run through the paces scientifically before you put it out there publicly,
Yeah,
'cause
and if you do that, let me know so I can start manufacturing the bleach pops, right? Because like that's what's I think's happening here. You
Yeah,
know.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, whether or not Kai Dickens is, like, has nefarious goals here, which she very well might, but whether or not she does or not, you know, the putting this out there publicly like this and disregarding all of the people who will come through and take advantage of this, is messed up in my opinion.
It is interesting to take a moment and run with the idea, though, just for fun,
Yeah.
um, of if this is a real phenomenon, what does that mean for the world?
Mhm.
Personally, like I'm sure that would be a very joyous thing for a lot of the families that have children that suffer with this, but I think it would make me a little paranoid. I've always felt
Uh
pretty safe in my thoughts, but the notion that potentially no, that inner barrier of your own mind's thoughts are no longer shrouded and visible only to you is very disconcerting.
right.
Like just
And
stop and think about the ramifications of that for a moment. If it can be conclusively proven that you are actually not safe in your thoughts,
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah, it changes everything, you know.
yeah,
And you better believe if this is real, there's a whole branch of the CIA full of nonverbal autistic people, right? Like, think about the
Well,
implications for things like espionage. And I was thinking, why, of like, I bet you most parents who have nonverbal autistic kids are great people, right? But surely not all of them, right? And if they pick up on this and they really believe it, what's stopping them from, taking them to the casino, right? Or something, or,
nothing. Yeah, I mean, hey, honestly, it would be a win-win. If I were the parent, like this would be like almost like a this is almost like a Rain Man situation, isn't it? That you're describing here.
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, right?
And I think that's important because, nobody's done that. Nobody's claimed to do that. Like, if this was a possibility, it's a pretty quick, jumping off point to think like, hey, let me like, okay, yeah, I could monetize this through a podcast, or like, what, let's go down to Wall Street, boys, and like, let's really monetize this thing.
Oh man,
Right.
like
So
they,
what?
they could they could break poker forever.
Yeah,
Just have them
they could.
sitting there and just
They
read
could.
They could
everyone's
break a
hand.
lot of
They could
things.
break everything. They could break
Yeah.
Yeah.
any cryptocurrency. They could break any bank. They could do anything.
Right.
This would be such an utterly destabilizing thing that I just, society as it is would not continue forward.
Right.
So
And
the fact that it is continuing forward is like enough proof that it's not real.
yeah. And
Yeah,
like
honestly. Yeah.
it stands to reason that if, you know, there like we don't know the mechanism by which it works theoretically, right? But it would stand to reason that there would be some way for a normal person to develop this ability as well, right? Um
Well, I wouldn't I don't agree with you because it would not be possible for a normal person to develop autism.
right, but well maybe. I mean, maybe we in the future can somehow alter the structure of our brain in some way, right? I guess though we can't really assume that it would be something materially based, right? Based on the claims that they make in the telepathy tapes.
And,
Um
Right.
cuz it
it,
does seem, they claim that it's something metaphysical and that it involves like higher power, God, whatever. And if that's the case, you know, why would this gift only be only pertain to people who are nonverbal, you know? Do you
Right.
think that's the case? Like, I don't think there
I
would
was
be any
thinking about that
reason
earlier. Yeah,
to believe that.
What, like God chose them?
Right.
That's what. Right. I
Like,
mean,
maybe, I mean, what, did they make some sort of deal in the pre-life
wow,
with the god?
wow.
Like,
I
they
mean,
trade, like, their ability to speak for this telepathic gift, you know? I don't know, it's just, like, it
yeah.
just the more you, like, think through it, the harder it is to believe.
And like
Yeah,
it
yeah.
takes these leaps of like unprovable things to like back it,
Mhm.
you know.
Right.
If this were ever proven to be real, then I would probably, ironically, start literally wearing tinfoil hats when I go out in public
Oh,
because
100%.
I gotta. I don't want
Well,
anyone reading mine.
I got
Like,
news for you, buddy, that tinfoil hat ain't gonna do shit for you if, Faraday cage doesn't even work, so
Yeah.
oh shit.
yeah, I don't know. And so I want to get into they kind of go into materialism in the podcast and kind of mock materialism and portray it as some sort of like belief system. I think it's pretty ironic the way that they talk about it. Um because, like as someone who I would probably consider myself a materialist, it's not like materialism is this like conceptual belief system that dictates my life. It more for me stems from looking at the world a certain way and, only acknowledging things that we can scientifically verify as provable real phenomenon. Um, it doesn't they kind of make this unfair claim that it rules out anything else when I personally don't think that's the case. I, for one, am like hard evidence based. So if we do find evidence of something that's metaphysical going on, then I'm 100% there. Zero, zero issues with it. If it's something that I can look at and say, yeah, this looks like we've reasonably fleshed out any possibility that this is not happening, I'm fully willing to accept it as true. Um and it really bugs me how they talk about it. And it to me gets to this bigger issue that I've noticed in society where it seems like there's this undercurrent in culture of anti-science or anti-materialism. Um, that kind of concerns me because people often talk about science, the scientific method, evidence-based evaluations of reality as something like religion or religious in nature or this belief system when it's not. It's science is small incremental discoveries that are built on rigorous methods for verifying and ruling out possibilities. And it bugs me so much that there's so much of this in culture today.
And excuse my ignorance here, but can't materialism be kind of a framework to figure these other things out? Am I understanding that correctly? I mean,
Yeah,
why do the two have to be separate? Is materialism just? Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, right?
yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it's first of all, the material world is what we have to work with right now. That's where we should start with everything. What we can see, touch, hear, feel,
Measure,
um,
right?
measure, right? This is the starting place for how we should evaluate claims like this. It doesn't rule out those things that we can't see, perceive, measure right now. It's just a way of looking at the world that goes, here's what we have to work with. We should start there, rule out everything we can, prove what we can currently, and leave an open mind for things that may come. You know, we don't know everything, but all we have is our experience in a physical material world. So to go above like to ignore that process and to make a claim as great as this um, just doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't seem right. You know.
I completely agree with you, 100%.
Yeah.
You know, the evidence should lead to the conclusion. You should never start with the conclusion and then try to like, fit pieces together to justify that
Right.
view.
Right. And
That's completely
th-
unscientific. Yeah.
there's so many people out there, videos, articles, so much information and everything out there that can give someone the illusion that they are looking at rigorous scientific proof of something. Um, it's just, I mean, I find myself doing it all the time. I'll read like an article title, and then in the back of like in my mind it's just like processes like, oh, this thing happened or they proved this, and I'll mention it to someone at some point. And then I go back and I'm like, I should like read more about it, and I'll read into whatever I said, and it's like, no, this article title is completely off base, and like, is greatly misrepresenting the thing that it's claiming. It's just so easy to fall into this way of thinking these days with so much information around us all the time. Um, which is why I think you see this prevalent kind of like anti-science bent that our culture is on.
Yeah.
It's just so
It's just so much
easy to
it's so much
reinforce.
easier,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Yeah,
Because
Yeah, and you're
go,
incentivized to like create these kind of thoughts too. It's like the wilder the claim, the more you can benefit off of it.
right,
mhm,
right. Yeah, it's so easy to you know, to rake in fame, money, power, whatever, utilizing people's short attention spans and dislike of rigor, because to really read into a lot of these complex topics, especially something like telepathy and these studies about RPM and all this, it's tedious. It takes time. It's a lot of dry scientific literature. It's a lot of nomenclature. It's just a lot to get through. And I'm not saying that we should, that everything that we believe, claim, and argue for should be like, we should all become like research scientists about every small topic and claim, but we definitely need to put more of an emphasis on critical thinking and rigor in modern culture, especially when we're so surrounded by a bunch of quick, massive amounts of news and information and theories and studies, and it's just so hard to wade through, but we should really put more of an emphasis on it as a society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there for a long time has like been this kind of distrust in the government and in the scientific community, and maybe some of it is warranted, right?
Yeah.
But it feels like we've moved the needle so far to the other side now that it's we're like approaching dangerous territory. Like it's anything science says is wrong, and like we only believe like the woo woo new age stuff, because that's what they don't want to talk about. But the reason they don't want to talk about it is because it's potentially not real. But
Mhm.
I am a little worried for society that we've kind of moved totally to the other side now.
Right. And it's a fair, it's a fair claim and assessment that, scientists are just people like everybody else, right? So some people get it wrong, some people are malicious, um, some people are just bad at what they do or whatever, right? So it's understandable to even have skeptic eye when you look at things that are, you know, seem to be scientifically rigorous too. And it's never a good idea to just blindly believe something because it came from, you know, a nature paper or whatever. Um, but we do have to pull back and recognize that most of the time things that happen in the context of the scientific method, are people who have really good intentions and are really trying to legitimately discover things. And it's slow, it's hard, it's tedious, it can be boring, but ultimately, it's the best way we have of verifying what's real and what's, what we can prove, what we can recreate.
It's got a
So,
pretty good track record too.
right, right. The whole reason we can listen to this podcast is because of the advancements of materialistic science, you know?
Yep.
Yeah. Which again, I guess it is rather ironic that so much of this stuff gets peddled on on these platforms when it was purely science that got us to this point.
Right.
Right. And I think that this podcast potentially sets kind of a dangerous precedent for like the twisting and manipulation of the scientific method itself. It's like almost riding on its coattails, you know?
Mhm.
When and obviously I haven't seen the video yet. I am very interested to see the documentary, but if I had to take a wild guess, it's probably not going to be up to the scientific rigor that we're talking about.
Mhm.
It may
Yeah.
claim to be, but I'm sure that it'll probably be pretty easy to punch holes through it.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so manipulating the scientific method, it's like one thing to claim something. It's another to claim that this is science, that you've worked the method, you've formed a hypothesis, you've tested it, you've done the whole thing. And I feel like that's even a step more dangerous than just making a wild ass claim, you know?
Yeah. Because I'm with you. My hunch whenever this comes out, we get to see it, is that it will masquerade as being a rigorous scientific series of experiments, which will convince a lot of people that
Right.
don't look at it with enough of a critical eye.
I think it's pretty clear it'll probably go that route just based on the contents of the podcast, right?
Mhm.
But if
Right.
it's any consolation, I saw plenty of people on the internet who are also saying a lot of the same things we've been saying. So not all hope is lost. There's still plenty of people out there that can uh, that can examine this with reason,
Right.
and so
And I would say I'm not even praying for Kai Dickens' downfall or anything, or even the lack of success for their what they're doing, but I would really, really implore them and would like to see them try and uh remember that, you know, what the implications of what they're claiming are, and to try and actually go about it in a scientific way. Um, but I don't have high hopes based on what I've heard. Um, but we'll see. I mean, if they go forward in a way that's legitimate and rigorous, then even if it comes to be that what they're claiming isn't the case, maybe it will be a net benefit for the nonverbal autistic community where we learn more about how they can communicate. Maybe this gets brings more public attention to research in this area. So, I just hope that it doesn't become a net negative, which I think it
Right.
has a lot of potential to.
hmm hmm
Well, um, do we have anything else to say about this?
I don't think so. The podcast
yeah,
is very entertaining. I will give it that. It was
Yeah,
definitely an entertaining listen.
you should, like I said in the beginning, go listen to it with an open mind. You know, please take into consideration what we have discussed. Obviously, our opinions are our opinions and are not the end all be all, but I implore you, if you do listen to it, at least try and consider some of the things that we're saying, because it shouldn't just be taken for granted. It's such a large claim, and there's so many vulnerable people involved. Um,
Hmm.
it's entertaining, and it's a beautiful thought. It's a very romantic notion. Um, but don't get carried away. Don't get swept away. You know.
yeah, and depending on if there's enough to material to chew on when the video comes out, like maybe we can revisit this topic in like a mini episode and dissect the video.
Hmm.
That could
Hmm.
be, so we could always touch back on this topic if there's more to look at. Who knows? Maybe it'll end up changing the world. Maybe we'll be just proven wrong.
That's the thing. Like I would love to be proven wrong. I would love for them to approach this properly and prove it. Like that would be great. That would be amazing.
Right.
You
Well,
know?
I have selfish reasons. I don't want anybody reading my thoughts, but it would be.
But maybe you could read other people's thoughts. Is that a worthy trade-off?
Ooh, full. Now that's an interesting idea. Full transparency across the board for everyone.
Try Solaris.
I was waiting for you to say something.
Yeah, it would be really crazy. Yeah, I don't know how I would feel about it. I would feel pretty conflicted. I mean, it would definitely, I think it would be a good thing because it would definitely illuminate a lot about what all this is, which is like, a question I love thinking about.
But it makes me the when I play with the concept, it makes me paranoid. Do you ever have, like, when you're walking around, you have a thought that is what I would describe as like an intrusive thought, like one that I would never act upon, one that would I would never want to see manifest in reality, but like like a dark thought, like, oh,
Right,
what if I
like you're
just like
standing at
push
the
this
edge of a
person?
cliff and
Yeah, or like, what if I just push this person next to me into the traffic? Like something I would
Mhm.
never do, but the dark thought will just pop up.
Mhm.
Like I wouldn't want anyone thinking that, or anyone hearing me think that, and then think that would actually be my. You know what I'm saying? Like, imagine the. I know I'm far
That's
from the only
him
one.
right there, officer. That's the guy.
But you see what I'm saying, though? Like sometimes you can't even control whatever random thoughts will just pop into your head, and the idea
Mhm.
that someone could just monitor all of them, that's
Right.
honestly like.
I think it's a good thing that humans have the ability to conceal thoughts, right? Because
Yeah,
like you said,
yeah,
if we didn't have that ability, I mean it's good in combination with our ability to self-reflect and reason, right? Because a normal person can have that kind of weird intrusive thought or go down some weird pathway in their head and then, just realize that it's a weird nonsense harmful thing and,
yeah.
um, it's good. It's a filter, right? Like we can filter what we put out there and how we communicate with people. And if we lost that, it would be pretty detrimental, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you would just start to like you hear somebody's first thought on something, and then you
Mhm.
would like I personally would just feel like, oh, okay, that's how they feel about it, and you wouldn't give them any time to actually like digest and apply logic to their thoughts.
Right.
Which
Honestly,
wouldn't be good.
to extrapolate, I think the conclusion we would all kill each other.
Yeah.
Probably
That's how it would end. That's my guess right now. If everyone could read everyone else's thoughts, it would actually like be the end of
And,
somebody has to have done a movie about this, right? I
oh,
mean, it's
I'm
like too
sure.
fundamental.
Well,
Right. I'm trying to
one thing
think.
that I was thinking of, it
There's
kind
like
of
the invention
relates.
of lying movie, right? Is that
Yeah,
kind of similar?
yeah, I think so. What I thought of, I know, Alex, we've talked about this before. You and I are both fans of the original Twilight Zone. I don't know if you
Oh
are,
yeah.
Brandon, but there's that one, oh, it's one of my favorite episodes. It's so creepy. It's that little boy that can manipulate reality with his mind, and he can read everyone's thoughts, so everyone has to constantly be thinking happy thoughts. Like they can't even deviate for a moment or allow their mind to wander, lest the boy hear it and dislike it, and then turn you into some unspeakable monstrosity. Like
Mhm.
I mean, I guess
that
this is
popped in my head.
1984 kind of, right?
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yep,
in a sense, it is.
yep. And, just think about, like, in a more, like, practical sense, think about the experience of these nonverbal autistic people with this ability walking through, like, going to the grocery store, because there's a lot of people out there who would be thinking some really, like, judgmental, horrible things about them,
Oh yeah,
and it's
Right.
gotta be, like, thinking that they're weird, thinking that, like, reading that they're uncomfortable, like, it cannot be fun for them to be able to hear everyone's thoughts around them,
It might be more
as
of
oh
a
yeah.
curse than a gift.
right, right?
Honestly,
Yeah, I didn't
though,
think about
yeah,
that.
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious. They should dive into that idea in the podcast. They should ask some of these people if they've ever had experiences like that.
I'm sure
You
they
know,
only hear good thoughts or something like that, you know.
Also,
right,
like,
right.
what's the mechanism here? Like, are they able to turn it off and on? Like, is it just a nonstop barrage of everyone's stream of consciousness in their vicinity? Like, that sounds horrible for anyone, right? Like,
I
I
think
can you
they
imagine.
yeah, I think they claimed that like it took some level of concentration,
Okay,
you
okay.
know.
Hmm.
And obviously there was well, not obviously, but there was like apparently levels to it too. Like some people's was stronger than others. You know, so
Mm,
it's a spectrum. It's not they're not claiming they're not claiming that like everybody has like it's on and it's on. It's like yeah, there's levels.
Right.
see,
Yeah, it's
see.
very curious.
Mm. Yeah,
Well,
well, boys, any other final thoughts on this one?
No,
I
not
don't
that I
think
could
so.
think of.
I think we
Yeah,
yeah, I think we went over it.
Yeah,
I'm happy.
yeah.
yeah, same.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where this goes, and like you said, maybe we'll do another episode about this at some point. But for now, this has been another episode of Mystery School Dropouts. Thank you to all of our listeners, past, present, and future, and we hope you join us for the next one.